What's up, guys? Back with your last little mini lesson here. Um, and this one is going to be about your citations and how to use evidence. Evidence is such a key part of an argumentative essay and of kind of what we're supporting your argument here. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Um, Now, I'm sure you guys are familiar with using evidence. Let's go over like a little bit of basic stuff and then we'll get into it. So, what is evidence? It's facts or information indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or valid. Why do we use evidence to support? For this case, it's going to be to support our argument. In most cases where evidence is being used, it's being used to support some sort of claim. So, your claim is your thesis, and now you need evidence to back it up. Now, as far as there's lots of different types of evidence. But as far as the evidence that you guys are going to be using for something like an argumentative essay, the first we have testimonial. So that's quotes. Could be from historians or could be from people who were there at the time. And these are things that you put in quotations, right? They're direct quotes. An example of this would be that few presidents have left in place so sweeping a list of positive domestic accomplishments. That's referring to Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society. And this is a direct quote that I took from an article. That's why I have it in quotations. It's something that somebody said. Now, testimonial is a great resource. Another great resource is for evidence is statistics. So these are measurements you find or percentages. I would like to qualify this and say it's super important that you double check that those statistics are correct. Sometimes different sources will put different numbers. If you quote one with numbers, just double check that at least other things are in the ballpark, right? Like that they're sort of similar. You don't want to have like really bad statistics from an unreliable source. So an example I have here, the Great Society also took a sizable bite out of poverty. The poverty rate fell by 26% between 1960 and 2010. So that is statistical data. You can Google it, you can check it. The reason that the ... is there is because there's more to that statement, but I didn't want to use it. So I took it out and made sure there's a ... So a reader would know there's something else to this quote here, but it wasn't relevant to what I'm talking about. So that's an important thing to note there. The other form of evidence that you're going to use is textual evidence. So this could also be direct quotes, but more importantly, it's accurate summaries or paraphrases. So you may read something that's really good, but you're like, I don't know how to use all of this. I don't want to use all the ... Like, I just want to summarize what they said. And that's fine, but you have to cite it. So this one is not in quotes. So you could say an author, this guy's Josh Zeitz. So Zeitz argues that the Great Society worked and places a great deal of credit solely on Johnson. You would need a citation with that. You can't just say that. You need their evidence or to give credit for their evidence. That's super important. Okay, you'll lose points if you don't cite things like that. In general, follow the Carvo rules for when you're looking for evidence or how to include evidence, what kind of evidence you should be including. So the evidence needs to be consistent with other evidence in the same source. They need to be supporting the same claim. Or if you use something with a different claim, then you'd have to argue against it, provide evidence that argues against it. So it needs to make sense. It all needs to be consistent with each other and have the, it's all supporting your argument. Is it accurate? You've got to check for accuracy here. You can't find some statistic that just supports your argument, but is from an unreliable source and it's a lie. So make sure that the evidence you use is accurate here. It's super important, particularly statistical evidence. Is it relevant? Don't include evidence just to say you included evidence and have it be meaningless, right? It needs to be relevant to what you're talking about. It needs to make sense. Why did you include that evidence there? It needs to be varied. So you need to have, a balance of quotes and summaries and statistics. You don't have to have all of them, but don't make them all quotes or don't make them all summaries. It has to kind of provide some balance there. And then the evidence needs to be objective. In your case, I would say it's okay if the evidence isn't completely objective, right? You are making an argument, so you're looking for people that support a similar argument, right? So a little bit more subjectiveness or opinionated stuff is okay. Make sure it's not extreme, because it still needs to be accurate and reliable, right? It needs to be relevant. And if it's super extreme, it's just not going to fit into that category there. So you want to be really careful with the kind of evidence you use. Take a second, let's read through this, and then we'll talk about it. So, although groups were of vital importance to the civil rights movement, all of their efforts may have been in vain had it not been for the actions of one man, Lyndon B. Johnson. It took the power of Johnson to bargain and convince Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, arguably some of the most influential pieces of civil rights legislation. Johnson followed up the passage of these bills with aggressive hardline enforcement strategies, particularly in the South, citing Article 1. The passage of this legislation had quick and long-lasting impacts. Before the Voting Rights Act, less than 7% of African Americans were registered to vote in Mississippi and about 19% in Alabama. By 1970, roughly 2/3 of African Americans in these deep South states were registered to vote. Most were able to exercise this right without interference. Again, citing Article 1. Without Johnson's strong leadership, the civil rights movement would have been far less successful. Does this meet our Carvo standards? Is the evidence consistent with each other? So what is my evidence here? I have Johnson following up the passage of bills with enforcement strategies, hardline enforcement strategies. And then my next quote is the results of that, right? The advancement of registering more people to vote. I would say that's consistent, right? Both of those quotes or both of that evidence supports each other. Is it accurate? I looked it up, and these statistics are correct. Roughly 2/3 of African Americans were registered to vote by 1970. So that is an accurate statistic there. Is it relevant? Do these support my argument here? The statistics about more people being registered to vote as a result of Johnson's actions is relevant, as well as the fact that it was his enforcement. That's what emphasizes the individual here, right? Like anyone can pass this, but it's the fact that Johnson enforced it and made sure it went through. That's relevant information, absolutely. I also want to add here that you do not ever want to end with a quote. Don't ever end a paragraph with a quote. You need to have something else that explains why that quote is relevant, right? So I say those are the results. Without Johnson's strong leadership, the civil rights movement would have been far less successful, right? We see this success here, and I reemphasize that it's because of Johnson that it makes it happen. Is it varied? Which is our V here. I have statistics and I have a summary of something an author said, right? It's not in quotes, it's a summary, but I still cited it, which you need to do. So I would say that's varied, right? Two different types of evidence. And is it objective? Statistics here, that is subjective, right? Like that, those are numbers. That's just like what the statistics say. So I would say that that's objective. Here, I kind of acknowledge the subjectiveness of the author. But like I said, because it's argumentative, it's okay if it's a little bit subjective, right? Because you need to find evidence that supports what you're talking about. And sometimes it's subjective. As far as my citation goes, all we're going to ask of you is to put numbers here. And then your works cited will just be a numbered list. And you just want to reference the numbers so we know where you're getting it from. Okay? Please be careful. You will lose points if you do not cite summaries. You can't just throw statistics in or information in that you are finding from a source without citing it. This is super important, okay? As I reemphasized it here, and I even forgot that I had reemphasized it. It's important. Let's read through this for a second and see maybe why this one doesn't fit as well. Although groups were of vital importance to the civil rights movement, all of their efforts may have been in vain had it not been for the actions of one man, Lyndon B. Johnson. Before, less than 7% of African Americans were registered to vote in Mississippi and about 19% in Alabama. By 1970, roughly 2/3 of African Americans in these deep South states were registered to vote, and most were able to exercise this right without interference. They were so impactful that, quote, Republicans have been committed to dismantling Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, a collection of programs the 36th president vowed would lead to an end to poverty and racial injustice, quoted. Think to yourself what's not perfect there, right? It's not horrible, but some things just aren't right. Think of Carvo. What Carvo things is it missing? Is it consistent? Does that evidence fit together? I would say no. This piece of evidence, I used it before. I think it's a good piece of evidence. But this one here, it kind of goes against your argument, right? It's saying that these things are being dismantled. I don't find this to be a super convincing, consistent argument here. There's better evidence. And I think it has to do with the fact that it's not really relevant. We don't need to know that. We want to know, why was this so successful? What about Johnson? Why was his individuality so important? Why is the individual so important here? And as in the last paragraph you saw, it's because he's so strict about enforcing it, right? He's tough on it. That's more important here than this quote. The other thing I want to mention is that I ended this paragraph with a quote. I don't explain this quote. I don't wrap it up in any way. I don't argue against this. Republicans have been committed to dismantling, blah, blah, blah. I don't say, but they've been unsuccessful because Johnson did such a great job, right? I don't explain it at all. And so that's something that you really need to think about. How have you explained your quotes? Have you set them up well? Did you kind of summarize afterwards? That needs to be included somewhere. As far as your citations go, we're only asking for three sources, guys. Other than that, you can go back through the PowerPoints, you can think about our lectures, and you don't have to cite any of that unless there's a quote we used. You should cite that quote. You need 3 reliable sources. Those are things like .gov, .org, .edu sources when you're Googling. If you use a .com, that's fine. Make sure it's reliable. We are going to look at them, so make sure it's reliable. All of this is going to go through what is that site called? Turnitin. It needs to be reliable, guys. You need to check accuracy. Don't use Weebly or WordPress or any blogs, okay? That is where the objective part comes in, right? Or the accuracy. You just don't know those authors. You can't check them up. The guy I used here, Josh Zeitz, down here, I looked him up. I found out he's a historian. He's a really well-known writer. He has a lot of information available to him. And so not everything he wrote was super objective. A lot of it was subjective. But I know he's a reliable source. And so you just want to be sure about that. Like I said, your works cited page, it's going to be at the end of your essay. And it should just be a numbered list of links, 1, 2, 3. And then throughout your essay, you should just see those numbers after quotes or summaries or whatever. You do not need to make citations. You do not need to put in MLA or in-text citations at all. That's not what we're looking for here. We just want to know where you got your evidence from and that it's a good source, okay? And the example you can look at is on slide 4, right? So right here, I put the ones in, and then at my works cited, you'll see 1, and that'll be the link there, okay? So what you're gonna turn in for this, I want you to write 1 body paragraph for your essay. Doesn't have to be your final copy, but I want you to turn 1 in so I can give you feedback. It should have 2 types of evidence from at least 1 source, just like my paragraph, right? 2 different types of evidence. They could both be quotes, they could both be summaries, whatever, but 2 examples of evidence from at least 1 source, or you could use 2. Quotes, paragraphs, paraphrases, statistics, whatever you want. The link should be at the end so I can check the reliability of that source. It should look like my slide 4. I just want to give you feedback. If you're not coming to the lunch sessions, I want to be able to like touch base with you, have you guys know what I'm how I'm feeling about your essay, how it's looking, making sure you're on the right track. Okay. It doesn't need to be your final. Just get an example in there of what you're going for, what your work's going to look like, so I can tell you if you're on the right track. Okay. Happy writing, everybody, and come to our lunch sessions.